Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dulce Dominguez. I am the Development Coordinator at Alianza Americas, currently based in Chicago. Welcome to the session from the Root Causes series of discussions on the root causes of migration with voices from leaders and allies in Central America, working on economic inequalities, democratic governance, and the rule of law, climate change, and other issues. This series is an effort to collectively build a deeper analysis on the root causes driving migration from Central America in recent decades, and what needs to change to address forced displacement in the region. Today, we will analyze development and economic policies and their impact on the social and economic rights in the region. We'd like to give a special thanks to our partners, the Latin American Working Group, Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, OXFAM America, Presente.org, Casa Yurumein, ONECA, Centro Presente, CARECEN Washington, D.C., CARECEN San Francisco, and Hondureños contra el SIDA. On this session with us today is a powerful women-led panel. We have Aracely Martínez giving us a perspective from Guatemala. Aracely Martínez is a Guatemalan anthropologist from Universidad del Valle de Guatemala, specialized on contemporary migrations and development. She is currently a consultant for NGOs and international cooperation projects. She is a researcher and teacher, and since 2015, she is the head of the Master in Development program at UVG. Aracely participates in a number of academic and civil society platforms, such as Guatemala Scholars Network, Plataforma Migración y Desarrollo, and Grupo Articulador de la Sociedad Civil en Materia Migratoria. We also have Wendy Bellanger giving us a perspective from Nicaragua. Wendy Bellanger is the provost at Universidad Centroamericana, UCA, where she started her career in 2002 as a researcher on youth gangs in Central America. Her research focuses on the sociology of higher education, and she analyzes the impact of neoliberal policies and quality audit in higher education in Europe and Latin America. We also have Yolanda González giving us the perspective from Honduras. Yolanda González Cedera is a researcher for the human rights area of Equipo de Reflexión, Investigación y Comunicación, Radio Progreso in Honduras, also known as ERIC. ERIC is a Reflection, Research, and Communications Team, a Jesuit program. Also with us today is Helga Cuellar from El Salvador. Helga Cuellar is an economist with a PhD in international and comparative education with an emphasis on economics and education finance from Columbia University and other areas of interest in her studies and research. And her studies and research include security and defense policies. Welcome, everyone. How are you all doing?
We are fine, thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with some questions. I'll ask one question and each of you will have a turn to answer it. And towards the end, we will take some questions from the audience. So for our first question, what are the goals and commitments of each of your countries on social development? And we can go ahead and get started with Helga.
Thanks for the question. Well, I should say that the commitment of current and past governments with social development in El Salvador is clear in both the official discourse and the public budget. For the past 20 years, the interest in reducing poverty and improving access to social services has been present in all social plans. Besides, in the last 20 years, the public budget for social development has quadrupled, going from about $683 million to a little bit more of 3,000 million. However, the social results are still relatively modest. Then we have a contrast between what is being said and also spent with the reality in results. Since the beginning of the 90s, after the signing of the peace accords to date, there has been a progress in the quality of life, but many people are still in conditions of poverty and vulnerability. Besides, the pandemic has deepened the structural social problems that have not yet been overcome. And I am referring to poverty and income distribution, unequal access to economic and social opportunities in the territories, migration, and trust in democratic institutions and among peers. El Salvador entered the crisis with the lowest percentage of people living in poverty in the last 30 years. Income poverty in 2019 was 26.8%. In November of last year, an increase of 14 percentage points in poverty was projected due to the fall in economic activity, remittances, the increase in the cost of the basic food baskets, and the loss of jobs and income. It must be clear that the crisis caused by the pandemic has not affected all people equally. Those most affected are the people in the poorest households and dependent on income generated from informal employment. Remember that about 70% of our population is in informal employment. About 26.8% of the population had incomes less than $120 a month before the pandemic. And 59% of the population had incomes greater than $120 a month, but less than $300 a month. This is a population vulnerable, and it's vulnerable to falling into poverty due to shocks such as the one caused by the pandemic. Therefore, I argue that the pandemic has increased the number of poor and reduced the middle class. And this is only that González not only says, I don't only say, but also the International Development Bank and many other organizations have also claimed the same. Regarding job loss, as of September 2020, 50,000 formal jobs were lost, and an estimated of 127,000 informal jobs were also reported as lost. And within the people in poverty and vulnerability, the groups most exposed to the impacts of the crisis on employment are the young people and women. And that's a very interesting point. Furthermore, the closure of schools is expected to accentuate the socioeconomic gap in educational attainment, which might translate into a loss of human capital development in the medium and long term. The government has promoted palliative measures to soften the negative impacts on the living conditions of vulnerable groups. However, it is difficult to fulfill this task without a comprehensive social protection system. The country entered an emergency without a clear vision of social protection, and today the social plan is not yet known. Furthermore, the response to the crisis has been hampered due to a lack of information and tools to effectively target aid to those most in need. There have also been difficulties in achieving dialogue between the public and private sectors on how to manage the emergency. And I'm ending saying this. In my opinion, the current government has the great opportunity to show a real commitment to social development by clarifying what the social plan is, showing greater transparency and accountability, and taking advantage of the capacities of the private sector to implement it.
Thank you, Helga. It does sound like there's a lot of opportunity for collaborative ways of addressing some of the issues that you were discussing. I will pass the word to Wendy. Would you like to share?
Yes, of course. Dulce, my field of study is higher education, and that's where my working experience has been. So I will focus my contributions mainly on that area. In Nicaragua, there has been a focus on the expansion of enrollment in education at all its levels, and it has been sustained for the last decades. However, this policy hasn't taken into account issues of quality properly, and efficiency and pertinence. So currently we have a very deep divide between the kind of education provided in the private sector, which is attended by the upper and middle classes, versus the public system attended by the majority of the population, where I think the most astounding data we can think of is the fact that teachers earn between $250 and $280 per month in Nicaragua. That is the lowest salary in the region. And this is a reality that is not even slowly changing. This government used to give teachers a bonus for some time, which came from the Venezuelan cooperation, but that was a very unstable kind of palliative for this such a low salary, such a low income. So apart from this, which I think is the most telling issue, we have a very limited availability of preschool education, which we know for a fact that is decisive for children's future, for the development of their reading and writing skills. We have poorly equipped schools in all the country, not only in rural areas, also in urban, in the biggest cities, even in Managua. We have a lot of multi-grade schools in many rural areas, and a predominance of empirical teachers with very tough working conditions. In higher education, we have also a focus on enrollment expansion that has been sustained, which is good because we merely have a 17% enrollment. However, the enrollment in public universities, which is what the government covers, is merely 28.79% or so. So the fact is most young people have to pay for their higher education in many kinds of universities. Like quality-wise, there is very poor control. So I would add that the policies for increasing enrollment haven't been paired with quality measures in any of the levels. And for example, in order to achieve a higher enrollment in universities, what the government does is remove admission requirements. So you have more people pouring into universities, but they are very poorly prepared. Also, the government created an online university, which was presented as a great improvement in terms of access to higher education, but really the quality there is also very dubious. This was before the pandemic. In a nutshell, I would say that the government's approach to education has focused on increasing enrollment in Nicaragua without the assurance that the service provided will be pertinent and will have the quality that the students deserve. So we have very high dropout rates, for example. So, and that I think is a very important issue to consider, how to really give education with high enrollment, but with quality.
I agree. I think being able to make enrollment at all accessible is important, but it's also thinking about the accompaniment that these students receive to ensure that not only do they enroll, but that they can succeed and remain in the programs.
That's right, and basic dignity for teachers.
Right, and ensure that teachers are also supported as they're carrying out this important work.
Correct.
I am going to pass the mic to Aracely. Would you like to share on this question?
Thank you so much, Dulce. Thank you, Alianza Americas, for the invitation. I think we share with Nicaragua and El Salvador the same situation. I think it's well known that our governments commit to social development in each campaign and basically forget about it after Inauguration Day. So there's no political willingness to improve the conditions of millions of Guatemalans, and this has worsened with the pandemic. Just a bit of history, since the 1990s, there has been a reduction of the budget for public social investment as a result of these neoliberal policies implemented throughout the 80s and the 90s through structural adjustment programs and other measures that were impacted here in Central America. And this has intensified the generalized economic crisis for middle and lower classes, especially in rural and indigenous areas, which were more affected by the armed conflict, political repression, and genocidal military operations in the 70s and 80s. So in general terms, this very low investment in public services, such as health, education, infrastructure, etc., mean less and less opportunities for families and communities. And of course, this relates to the state debt with the Guatemalan society because the peace accords have not been accomplished since 1996. So it's a very complicated situation. And although there are some efforts from the government, such as linking the Sustainable Development Goals to the National Plan for Development called CATUM 2032, and some transparency and information platforms for auditing public investment, these are not enough for achieving social development. For example, just to some data for 21 right now, according to the National System of Public Investment, up to date, March, right now, the global execution for health, poverty, malnutrition, justice and security, and other social priorities established by the government is less than 13%, when it should be around 30%. So these indicators are very preoccupying, very worrying. And also we can see this in several aspects. For example, the public spending is approximately 60% in average each year. There is very low or no budget assigned for health, education, water and sanitation, environment, other social services. The priorities for investment are in roads, military and defense, fertilizers, and other social programs that favor obscure and clientelar transferences. And this public investment implementation system allows for corruption, clientelistic practices, and private sector, but also right now, drug cartels, actors, co-optation in public decisions. So we can go on and on and on with these problems, but there is, it is a very complex situation with very little efforts to cope with it.
Okay, great. Sounds like sometimes we are prioritizing private corporations or other things over the important human needs that our communities are in dire need of, especially considering the past year that we've had with the pandemic and several climate-related emergencies. Thank you so much, Aracely. I'm gonna pass the mic to Yolanda.
Thank you, Dulce and Alianza Americas for the invitation as well. I think we share so many things in this answer. When we talk about social development in Honduras, I think we all agree in Central America, I have to admit that we feel we are far away. It's like a thing that we see in distance. There is because in Honduras, and I think we share in some of the countries, there is a development model that generates poverty, inequality, exclusion, environmental and ecological deterioration, and an institutional crisis, the crisis of the rule of law. And this can be seen in so many examples. I just, as Aracely did, just give a couple of them just to have an overview. If we talk of employment, since 2009, the government has promoted public policies aimed at deepening job insecurity. According to the National Institute of Statistics, 80% employed people reported earning less than the minimum wage. Let's look at the children and youth. They face a situation of violence. Of the almost 4,000 homicides reported in 2018, most of the half of these murders corresponds to children and young people. It's estimated that almost 1 million children are out of the school before the COVID, before pandemic. Probably now there are many more. And 300,000 children are labor force. There is a low educational coverage, less than 30% of 15 to 17-year-old people are at school. And only 31% of women who are not studying have a job, of young people. Tegucigalpa, we can see Tegucigalpa, the country's capital, only 50% have regular access to water, for example. And we could go on. So what does the administration understand right now by social development policies? What we have since quite a lot of years ago, what we have in reality are just assistance programs I share the appreciation of Aracely. And this state social assistance response has had no impact on poverty and inequality levels. There are no programs that address the problem of poverty and inequality from a comprehensive approach. Rather, assistance programs such as this like $400 bonus or eco stoves programs have become the only solution proposed by the government to overcome poverty, and these programs are assigned based on political and clientelist interest. They are ineffective, and it's proof that they are really an effective means to achieve activists and votes.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think a lot of your responses are pointing to an underinvestment in social programs that are crucial for our families and children. And I think, again, just you're speaking about things that were happening even before the pandemic. So to think how these issues have been exacerbated by what we've been experiencing the last year, it's easy to understand why so many people are feeling forced to leave their countries. So this kind of, I guess, leads into our second question, speaking about how currently some of these programs are or are not being funded. The question is, how is social development funded in your countries? And I'm going to go with Helga again, if you'd like to respond to the question. Oh, you're on mute.
Sure. Let me explain what happens in El Salvador about this. Most of the budget for social development in this country is financed from the National General Fund, but there is a significant proportion of resources that come from external loans and international cooperation. These funds are usually used to finance strategic infrastructure and social services projects or specific programs to serve population at risk and in poverty. Currently, about 42% of the public budget is allocated to different areas of social development, such as education, health, housing, local development, among others. And I've said before that the budget for social development quadrupled in the last 20 years. However, although increases in social development are good and desirable by themselves, they are not a guarantee that they are going to solve social problems. The challenge of achieving a balance between meeting social needs and the country's fragile financial situation prevails. What I'm saying in the end is that you can have a great plan, you can have a good commitment with social development, but if there is no funding, it's very difficult to fulfill those needs. Besides other things that I'm going to explain soon. The fiscal deficit currently in El Salvador is very high. It's about 90% of the internal, the Producto Interno Bruto, which will be, I forgot the word in Spanish for that. Please, you remind me, Dulce?
Which word you're looking for?
It's 90% of the gross domestic product.
Oh,
the fiscal, the debt, the current debt in El Salvador. And also current projections have a claim that is unsustainable. If we continue like that, it will be very difficult to get enough funding to finance social development. And also there is an expansive budget in expenses that doesn't consider the necessary financing. This situation presents 5 challenges, and I'm going to explain each of them. The first challenge, financially speaking, is the feasibility and sustainability of the budget and the social investments in the country. Currently, the country's capacity to carry out the proposed social investments in everything is at risk in a context of economic reactivation with limited tax collection and high debt. That's the first thing. That we don't necessarily have the means to be able to fulfill all the promises in social development in terms of the planning. Secondly, there is a lack of clarity in setting priorities. It is key to question what to invest in and set realistic and achievable objectives. However, this is not happening in El Salvador, and this has always been a problem. The budget project leaves unattended multiple social areas that have been affected by the pandemic. And that's the other concern, that the pandemic has shown us different problems that are not necessarily being solved through the plan, the current economic plan. There is also a lack of clarity in the establishment of investment criteria. It is unknown if there are parameters to do so, and if they were defined based on priorities. It is questionable whether feasibility, cost efficiency, and target criteria were considered to define the lines of action of social investment. In fact, we don't even know what the social plan is because it's not available to the public. There is also this dispersion of resources, and also, as I said before, it is unknown what the plans are regarding social policy. There is no plan available for the public. For example, the National Health Plan, the vaccination plan against COVID-19, and the plan to close the digital gap in education are considered confidential information by the current government. And without transparency, accountability, and knowledge of the strategic planning of social investment, it is very difficult to evaluate the efficiency of budget allocations and the public management. Based on the above, I believe that the current government's commitment to social development is very similar to that of previous governments. And there is a strong discourse of support of social development, which is accompanied by budget increases, and has many implementation challenges, feasibility and sustainability problems, and recently greater restrictions on access to information on social plans and lack of transparency and accountability and how the funds are being used. It's important to address these limitations and challenges in order to improve the execution capacity on social results. Otherwise, the same problems related to low quality of life will remain. And it will be very difficult to improve the conditions for people to feel that it is in this country where they can achieve their dreams.
Thank you, Helga, for your perspective. I'm going to pass the mic to Wendy.
Thank you. I think I should start by saying that in Nicaragua, public spending in education is just 4.3% of the GDP. And if we compare it to Costa Rica, our neighboring nation, which is also the country where most of our migrants go, that is 7% of their GDP, with also a stronger GDP. So as with other areas like health and infrastructure, education has also received support from the IDB in loans, very significantly for the neoliberal turn that was created in the 90s, which consisted of supporting reforms to achieve a decentralization model of schools all over the country. Experts believe that this process opened the door to a privatization of the funding of public schools. So we ended up having poor families having to pay for the basic needs of schools. So for example, if they wanted their children to have chalk in the school, well, families had to come together and buy also cleaning materials, any need the school had, well, families ended up having to pay for it. So of course, this neoliberal approach was scrapped. However, the main problems remain. So, all right, we shouldn't charge poor families and give them the responsibility to carry the school. However, teachers are still being paid very poorly. And in addition, they have had to endure very persistent political indoctrination from the school. So all instead of having teacher training in teaching methods, for example, they have to have training on political party issues. So the curriculum has also been tainted with government political party propaganda. And we just need to take any of the school textbooks in history or Spanish, and we find that it's very obvious. And of course, the teachers are not the ones producing this kind of material, but it's the ministry. Significantly, when we look at higher education in Nicaragua, we find a greater stability in terms of funding. So since the 1990s, the 10 universities members of the National Council of Universities have a budget that is 6% of the total budget in the country. So every time the budget is passed, the universities of this council know how much their budget will be. So it's kind of like a safer bet for higher education than it is for basic education in the country. And I think that is significant because we know how important basic education is, and our public monies should be mainly given to that level of education. In higher education, it's obvious to me that the financing has become today a gateway for the current government to destroy university autonomy. So I know this may sound like terrible because we've had lots of struggles to have the right to funding of higher education. However, the financing of state universities has definitely been used to turn staff and students into political clients in the current moment. So we've had universities as a result actively participating in repression of students and staff, and that's the current reality. So unfortunately, if you are a young person in Nicaragua, then you have you don't have a choice but to either pay very high prices for a private education, or you go to the public sector where you will be treated as a political client.
Thank you for that perspective, Wendy. I'm gonna pass the mic next to Aracely.
Thank you. I think El Salvador and us share a lot of problems. I mean, the region in general shares a lot of problems. Guatemala has one of the lowest tributary load systems in the region. Nonetheless, up to 2020, taxes financed around 75% of the national budget. The rest was financed by public debt in around 19% represented this public debt to finance the national budget, donations and other sources. But after the pandemic, our Congress authorized an increased public debt for almost 20 billion quetzales, that's around $3 billion, of which around 14 billion or 70% were assigned to the programs related to COVID-19. So this changed the financial structure of the budget. And in this scenario, taxes help pay only 60%, while public debt finances 33%. So this has increased the fiscal deficit from 2.2 in 2019 to 5.8 in 2020. So it's very large increase. This situation, of course, requires reinforcing tax payments and increasing the tributary load in order to be sustainable. But because if this doesn't happen, the public debt will be equivalent to 3.5 times the annual tributary income, way up high from the recommended 2.5. But of course, this requires the agreement from the economic sector and of course, a new tributary pact in the Guatemalan society that includes not only more taxes, but also a more participatory budget that addresses the priorities of each territory and each population or each thematic priority, transparency, social audit, and of course, compliance from the government. And to all these, we must add always the high corruption in public spending, the influences of drug cartels and economic elites in state decisions, and the structural racism that crosses all the system, creating an unequal and discriminatory society in which rural, indigenous, women, LGBT, and other populations are excluded. Thank you.
Thank you, Aracely. And lastly, Yolanda, would you like to share?
Sure. As mentioned above, we assume, I think we all agree, that there is no funding for a social development policy as such, because there is no social development policy as such. No? But having said that, I would like to focus on 3 points. First of all, as my colleagues suggested, let's look at the national budget. Precisely, this is a permanent complaint of the Honduran society from different sectors. The percentage of the budget allocated to defense and security has grown in the last 10 years, while the percentage of the budget for health and education has decreased. In budget, for the first time in the last 40 years, the combined budget of the ministries of security and defense exceed those of the Ministry of Health. It's just like examples. Let's look at per capita public spending on health. The average in Latin America is $600 per capita. In Honduras, the expenditure is $158 per person. It has a lower expenditure. And we can give more and more examples, but we have 3 minutes. So I would like to point out as well that the COVID pandemic and the hurricanes last year have shown us once again that it's not just a question of money. It's not only a question of money. Honduras is the Central America country with the largest budget for the pandemic, almost $4,000 million, and the one with the highest rates of infected people and with a collapsed health system. Last November, 4 million people were affected by the hurricanes, and government asked for money to everyone willing to listen to. 3 or 4 months later, there are still people on the street because they lost everything without any kind of public response, only threats that they will have to vacate the street. 3 months later, there are many families who have had to return to their communities, which will be flooded again as soon as it starts raining. By June, rains are coming because the infrastructure has not been prepared. And in addition, we can see that in this crisis of 2020 and 21, more international actors were not willing to give money to the public sector because of the obvious corruption. This is a good solution in the short term. Civil society has applauded and we agree with. However, it's not a long-term solution. Civil society cannot be bundled with the burden of social development policies. Its role is to work with public institutions, not to replace them. This is further evidence that the public system, understood as public institutions that look after the interests of the majority, does not work as it is now. It's broken, it has collapsed. The system in Honduras, in Central America, has ruined.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think all of your responses have very similar patterns in thinking about the transparency that is needed and the lack of systems available to keep government accountable. I also think that last thing that you said, Yolanda, about civil society kind of taking on the burden and taking on the role that the government should be playing is something that we've been seeing all too often, especially during, Alianza Americas was working in partnership with Presente.org and Hispanic Federation to help fund, sorry, my computer's giving me a little signal, to help fund groups that were doing, the emergency response. And what we were hearing from groups was that, thinking about how they were working with governments, there was no government in sight, or there was no type of information of how are we going to work together, as opposed to just the organization or civil society being the sole people responsible for responding to these. So thinking about everything that you all have been talking about, in your view, what is necessary to change in your countries in order to end poverty and protect the planet so that its citizens can live and thrive in their home countries? It's a big question, but I'm eager to hear your responses.
Should I start? Yes. Well, I must start saying that reality always imposes, and this is the moment to revalue social policy and rethink it. It is essential to articulate short, medium, and long-term measures to meet the needs of the most vulnerable today, strengthen the social protection system, and face new demands for current and future emergencies. I think the pandemic has taught a great lessons for us, and one of them is that we should really think social policy, rethink social policy. One of the most important challenges of social policy today is how to face the problem of unequal opportunities. And this is common in the region, and I think it's a problem that it not only belongs to this region. Social policy also faces the challenge of responding to constantly evolving human needs and problems that affect different groups of population in different ways. This complexity of social policy has become evident during the pandemic, which has had repercussions on the quality of life, especially of the poorest population, children, youth, and women. The most marked gaps are related to access to health, education, employment, areas that are fundamental to enhance the capacities of people and the means to make them self-managers of their own development. Faced with this situation, I propose that in order to reduce inequities and strengthen social cohesion and improve social development and quality of life, it is important that social policy be comprehensive. It means that go beyond social assistance policies, as it was mentioned before. It also should promote an adequate balance between the implementation of different measures. Some of them must enhance the capacities of all people through the universalization of social services, education, health, housing, etc. But there should be some other measures that should be aimed at protecting the most vulnerable. In addition, it must include short, medium, and long-term actions that are financially and politically sustainable. And this implies that we should go over the making of plans for 5-year periods. We should think with a different perspective, long-term perspective, and have a plan that has a vision for the long term with concrete goals for different periods. And also we must assure the funding to be able to implement that plan through the long term. Being non-discriminatory and redistributive, social policy should aim also for all people, especially the poorest and most vulnerable. It also has to have equal access to opportunities to improve their level of well-being. And to the extent that this is achieved based on a solid institutional framework and the commitment of different actors to development, social policy will contribute to strengthening what I said, social cohesion, quality of life, social development, and the construction of a more just, balanced, and equitable society. Considering the effects of climate change, I believe that it is also imperative to move towards a resilient society, which is something that is not currently included in any social plan in many of the Latin American countries. And for this, it is necessary to establish a development agenda, agree on social policy priorities, and ensure its financing. And I must add that it is also imperative to to involve the private sector in this definition of what a social policy should be, what their goals should be, and how it should be financed. And also we should rely on the capacities of the private sector to be able to execute it successfully.
Thank you, Helga, for your input. I'm going to pass the mic to Wendy.
Yes, well, Dulce, this question is, I mean, that's the main question we've been asking in Nicaragua today. You know, we feel we are at a crossroads this year. It's almost as if it's 1979 all over again, perhaps with a savvier dictator. In November, what needs to change? In November this year, we need to be able to reestablish democracy once again in our country. And hopefully we can achieve that by voting. That's what we are wishing for. But for that, we need transparent elections. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to obtain any kind of certainty from the government in that sense. And if we don't have real elections in the country, we will fall deeper and deeper into chaos, state repression, unemployment, poverty, and the country will continue in a downward spiral. Now, if we are able to have real elections, the new government in Nicaragua will need a lot of support in a much needed process of transitional justice, reestablishing the rule of law in the country. And that will hopefully help us all to heal from the trauma of having endured years of violent repression. We really need in Nicaragua separation of powers in the new government, because that has effectively disappeared totally, 100% in Nicaragua. All the powers are controlled by the executive, all of them. There is no space for checks and balances at all. So we need, I'm going to talk from my perspective, from my experience. We need definitely a better administration of the education budget that allows us to improve, first of all, the training and salaries and working conditions of teachers and the conditions in schools. We also need a thorough revision of the school curriculum. I think that's urgent. And we are also in dire need for the return of university autonomy in the country, because I believe it is a basic condition for the creation and the transference of knowledge. And our countries really need that. Now, lastly, repression in Nicaragua turned many university students and many university professors and young professionals into exile. The universities expelled hundreds of students because of political reasons, and they need now to allow them to return, to finish their majors. For many of them, their records were erased. They were condemned to a kind of academic death. And the government needs to make the country safe again for the return of hundreds of citizens who had to flee, most of them to Costa Rica, but many of them to other Central American countries and to the United States. And I was reading a question post in the chat area, and they talked about how Biden said, well, maybe we should help direct. I think Yolanda talked about that as well. And I just wanted to add, of course, that sounds like a great idea because our governments are quite corrupt. But in our case, in the case of Nicaragua, Ortega has passed a law that is called a law on foreign agents. So that is absolutely illegal nowadays. So he wants to stop other countries from cooperating with civil society in Nicaragua. So that has been the greatest blow for this country. We finished last year with a battery of repressive laws. So he's making repression legal in the country. So many things have to change in Nicaragua. And as I finish saying what I said when I started, we are at a crossroads, and in the month of November, things in Nicaragua can really get to a point of no return, and we are going to be worse, and we're going to have masses of migrants going everywhere, or we can start rebuilding our country once again.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I will now move to Aracely.
Thank you. Listening to my colleagues and your question, I was thinking about how about starting anew. I mean, rebuilding from zero. It's very difficult. Since it's a systemic problem, I think everything must be addressed very holistically. So, but of course, it is very difficult because we must disentangle step by step in each aspect. And as my colleagues have said, the pandemic has made more than evident that we lack the conditions for a true social development. Unemployment increased, more and more people in the informal sector without social security, inefficiency from the government to implement the programs, corruption everywhere, increased feminicides and gender violence, educational exclusion in the rural areas, but also in the poor urban territories, etc., etc., etc. And of course, we could begin, for example, in actually implementing the national plan, CATUN 2032, and meeting the sustainable development goals through public policies that actually have a budget, because this is a recurrent challenge. I mean, policies are approved without a budget. So how can it be implemented? It's like nonsense. Of course, combating corruption, having more public transparency, social audit, prioritizing social investment, especially education and technological inequality in rural areas, implementing social protection measures for everyone, for example, with a minimum income to address the pandemic effects, and addressing climate change effects, among others. And of course, we need to keep on the dialogue with different sectors, the private one, churches, government in different levels, academia, civil society. But all of this requires more taxes and financing and reviewing the economic model we have, economic and political model we have. And this is something that the economic and political elites do not like. And I think that as a region, we have the opportunity to develop a regional plan that could address common situations such as migration flows, climate change, because of course borders are fictional to it. And the dry corridor goes from Guatemala to Nicaragua and parts of Costa Rica. And so we have these Central American institutions that already exist that could carry on this lobby instead of being these dead entities that only serve corruption again. So we have a lot of challenges, and we need a lot of conversations going on and different agreements being made in different sectors.
Thank you, Aracely. Yolanda?
Well, it's a challenge question to answer in 3 minutes, and I'm not surprised of how many things and how many answers we have in common. I want to start with the voice of the people. What do people from Honduras dream of? Eric did a survey on what the Honduras population dream about. The family dreams are, in this order: to have a decent job, to have a house, for everyone to be able to study, to walk freely in the street, to have food. These are our dreams. When asked how they dream of their country, they dream of a country without violence, with all the people working, without corruption and impunity, with education and health for all. So some really short ideas of what we need. Perhaps we have to begin talking about long-term investment in development. with real participation of communities. Priorities should include drinking water, access to land in rural areas, health, education, policy that promotes jobs with decent conditions, especially for youth. We have the women organizations have here, I really like a slogan, we need a job, but we need a job with dignity. Trabajo sí, pero con dignidad. And as Aracely, I think, they point out, and all of my colleagues point out, the economic model in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, meaning Central America, is based on destruction of natural resources, destruction of the environment, and criminalization of those who defend it. This must be changed. So last, but absolutely not least, as we all said, we cannot be blind. The state, at least in Honduras, at all levels, has been captured by drug trafficking networks. Public institutions are no longer public. Democracy needs to be rebuilt. We usually, and I take this with Aracely, we usually, here in ERIC and the social movement, we usually speak of shared basic agreements. Actors from different sectors of society, businessmen, trade unions, peasants, intellectuals, international organizations, let's agree on a minimum consensus to start rebuilding societies, social development policies, and democracy. I mean, we have to dream, and we have to put the steps to get that dream.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, and everyone for sharing your perspectives. I think that there is much work to do, and there's kind of a twofold of, responding to the immediate needs that are, that people need right now, but also intentionally and strategically addressing what is causing these things, to not only be placing a Band-Aid on, the multiple crises that we're facing, but to also be addressing the systemic and structural issues that caused them in the first place. So now we're going to move to questions from the audience, and the first one here is the one that Wendy kind of touched on a little bit earlier, which is in President Biden's press conference today. He said that a way to stem the migration flow from Central America is to directly fund programs or solutions in these countries, bypassing corrupt leaders. What kind of things could the Biden admin fund directly that would help the people directly so they decide not to come to the US? And I will go to Yolanda first for this question.
Well, I think I'm really glad of this question. I think probably, I assume Alianza Americas or another organization will need a seminar, a webinar about this. I think there are now, it's a good thing, several initiatives, regional initiatives and dialogues between organizations from Central America and the United States, even with organizations from Mexico as well, like regional initiatives to dialogue and to share some proposals. And I think it's really important that citizens from United States and Central America will be paying attention to these proposals. I just writing down here the link to one of these proposals, but I know there are others we are working in and will be published these days. This is root causes framework is a proposal from, I think, 100 of grassroots and faith organizations from the region, and some of the proposals I explained are taken from this. They said just this long-term investment in leadership, development community, in working on democracy means a stand with civic, indigenous, and faith organizations that are fighting for democracy. But I would like as well to say something that I think is one of the key points that some initiatives are saying loudly. I mean, the US government should stand not with corrupt officials and abusive security forces, but with the citizens and civil society organizations working to build more democratic, just, and inclusive societies. And it's important to listen to the civil society and Central America citizens to identify these causes of migration: corruption, impunity, human rights abuses, gender-based violence is increasing and increasing. Poverty, inequality is not poverty. I think this is one of the conclusions of today. It's not just poverty, it's exclusion, it's inequality. Exclusive economic models and climate change. And this, I would like to I know there are more questions and probably more, some of my colleagues would like to say something more about this, but what I think, from my point, Biden and the administration should understand is that corruption, inequality, exclusion, human rights violations are not inevitable, but rather are the result of deliberate choices by the people who are in power in these countries.
Thank you, Yolanda. I'd like to ask if anybody else on the panel would like to also chime in. I flagged Yolanda because I know she really wanted to contribute to that. So I'd like to take this opportunity for anybody else that would like to contribute, or I can move on to the next question. Aracely?
Yes, I agree totally with Yolanda. I think there is an opportunity with transnational organizations for example, Guatemalans in the United States and in Guatemala through these civil society organizations like this migrant civil society, for example. I think there's opportunity, but also I think that that's an opportunity to strengthen the local government institutions, because of course we need to play with the national system. I mean, either national or local level systems, in the sense that there's need to create synergies in territories. So and this links with another question that I saw around the chat, or I'm not sure where, but here in the chat, I think, if there are experiences with local governments. Of course there are. There's this, how to say this, I'll say it in Spanish, Red Nacional de Grupos Gestores, which is an institution that tries to build local producers, local committees for producers that try to engage with the local governments. Of course, there are more and less successful initiatives, but of course, this try to get together the communities and engage in conversations with the local governments and try to, stimulate the economic dynamics in their territories. And of course, there are very good or sensible bureaucrats. I'm not saying that everyone is corrupt. The system is corrupt and it allows for corrupt practices. But of course, there are people that want to engage in social development and try to do the things in the best way they can. But of course, the system does not allow. So it's not, I think, as a person that we need to address, but the system as a whole. So yeah, I think there are opportunities if the Biden administration wants to try a different approach.
Thank you so much, Aracely. And we're going to move on to the next question, which might be one for Helga, but I also will give the opportunity for others to contribute if they wish. And this is, can you please highlight best practices in social development? Can you comment on successful efforts in the region to bring together local governments with the private sector for purposes of obtaining greater synergies between formal and non-formal education and the needs of the labor market?
Well, that's a very interesting question and a good question, I must say. I think around the region there are many good practices. Can you hear me? Yes, I have problems with my internet right now. Well, I think in the region there are very good practices of collaboration um, between local governments and the private sector. There are many non-civil organizations, NGOs that are working currently in attending several social needs. And there are many alliances that are working also at the local level that very little is known about in general. I think this is the time to be able to compile these best practices around the regions and within the countries to really identify successful factors that make policy implementation easier and also efficient. In El Salvador, for example, we have different municipalities that they have been very good at organizing private sector initiatives and also collaborating with the school sector. There are many municipalities that allocate some funds for hiring teachers, for example, or helping to improve infrastructure in alliance with private businesses also. And there are many social responsibility programs in the country that are addressing different needs in education, in terms of infrastructure, sometimes also in terms of providing educational material, or even providing scholarships to kids. There are other programs of social responsibility that are working on improving the environment, for example, and giving the means to people in the rural area to produce with higher rentable income, produce more and having more income, but also taking care of the environment in a good way. There are several, but the point here that I want to make is that very little is known. And this is the time that we can use to compile this information to be able to use it. In terms of migration, for example, there are a few municipalities in the country, in El Salvador, that are trying to have specific programs to enhance local opportunities for employment, for training for the youth. And this is also being done in alliance with the central government. Perhaps the weakest point is that this vinculation with the central government is not very strong. And there are a lot of difficulties of communication and also access to information and funds that hopefully this will change in the coming months.
Thank you, Helga. Before I move on to the last question, I just want to give an opportunity to anybody else that would like to chime in at this moment. If not, I'll move to the last one. And this might be a good question for Wendy. What are your perspectives on zones of employment and economic development? Or do any of the panelists consider labor market rigidity as a cause of unemployment and informality?
Yeah, informality has definitely been steadily growing in the country, and there has been an effort there was an effort by the current government from the beginning to to make companies and institutions formalize their employees and to make them go into social security, for example, just that. But since 2018, things have plummeted in the in the formal job market so much that I think right now we would need a total restructuring of our strategy for formality in job markets, and a new kind of dialogue with the private sector, because the private sector has been in total accordance with the regime since the beginning, and they were benefiting from lots of controls that the government, did, and from keeping the minimum wage as low as possible. So from on the one hand, some things seem to be developing in favor of workers. On the other hand, they were getting worse. So it's very hard right now to think about strategies in the current situation, because our social security system is totally collapsed, almost to the point in which it will just stop functioning. And it's very hard for companies to widen their formal team, and so to have their workers have contracts that they would be more stable and have their right to health insurance, for example. It's getting tougher and tougher for employees to do that. And that's happening in our university, for example. It's very tough to right at this moment in Nicaragua talk about a better conditions for workers.
Thank you, Wendy. Before we close up, is there anybody else on the panel that would like to contribute to this question?
Yes, really short. I think very clearly that zones of employment and economic development will cause more forced migration. Absolutely. And it's just, like to go 100, a century back. Is los enclaves bananeros, I don't know how you say, but it's like we haven't learned everything, nothing, we haven't learned, we have learned nothing from the enclaves bananeros in the beginning of the 20th century. I think it's really clear for us this point, and this will be, and this is really a factor of migration, forced migration.
I would also like to add a point, because I must say that I have learned also from my colleagues here, and I just want to pinpoint the things that I believe that are important to reduce migration, or making an option, not an obligation for many people. And I agree with Yolanda in terms of the need for strengthening local governments and the participation of communities. Listen to the voice of the people. I think that's key. I like Wendy when she says and states that if we don't strengthen the rule of law and also improve democracy, things are not going to be better. Also, she addressed the need for transparency and also the importance of investments in education, which I totally agree with her. And Aracely, I am very moved for what you said, especially about the importance of reducing corruption and address better the social needs in terms of facing greater inequalities that in Guatemala are as large as in the other countries in the region. And finally, I think what we can learn from El Salvador is that we need to rethink social policy and its financing. And also, really, if we don't solve the implementation problems, reduce corruption, make investment more efficient, it would be very difficult really to improve the opportunities for the people to really believe that it's in our countries where they can fulfill their dreams.
Thank you all so much. And Helga, I think you explained and summarized a lot of what was said, very important points. And I think thinking back to something that I believe you said, or maybe Aracely, that everything is very intersectional and intertwined, and there's not a sole solution or a way of properly prioritizing where do we go first, because there are so many things that need to happen at the same time. And I think thinking about social development and the investment and the way that we are prioritizing our funding, it's not just about where we're getting money from or where we're putting it, but also what is happening with it and how are we centralizing human dignity as a center point for achieving what it is that we need for people in these communities. And kind of, I guess, thinking about the intersectionality of things, we want to invite you to the next session of our Root Causes series. and I believe my colleague is now projecting it. It's part 3, thinking about fiscal management and inequities. Sorry, it's just in the way. So part 3, fiscal management and equities. We will have Ricardo Barrientos from Guatemala, Ana Iris Martínez from OXFAM in El Salvador, Julio Ruelas from UNAH in Honduras. That will be April 1st at the same time. We hope to see you there. Make sure you register and share with your networks. And lastly, I just want to thank our lovely panelists for the information and the important work that you are doing. We really greatly appreciate it. And thank you everyone for viewing and participating. This is being recorded, so if you'd like to go back and hear more or hear again the important points that were made, please visit our website, alianzaamericas.org. Thank you so much.